As the saying goes, men lie, women lie, numbers don't. But that's not always the case when it comes to fantasy football. And sometimes the numbers don't tell the full story. And it's up to us to uncover the context for what's truly needed to fully understand the truth. In this series, I'll be going through the truth of every high selected fantasy player's 2022 season, uncovering any contextual patterns I can find, and painting the picture for what we can potentially expect moving forward entering 2023 for fantasy football. You guys would have seen me break down the full first round of players in this format last week. And if you haven't already, make sure you go check that video after you watch this one. But with that being said, let's not waste any more time and let's get right into it. All right, we dive into the first player on today's video, and that's going to be the 201 according to Underdog Fantasy current ADP. That's going to be Amon Ra St. Brown, wide receiver of the Detroit Lions, going off the board as the wide receiver 9, like I mentioned on Underdog Fantasy. So for the truth of his season, we look at splits in games he played over 50% of the snaps. This was a player that dealt with numerous injuries throughout the year. I believe he left the Dallas game early. I believe he got banged up in another game. Regardless, not all the games that he played last season out of the 16, he was deemed fully healthy. So I isolated those stats down. I looked at games he was fully healthy in, and the numbers speak for themselves. 16.7 PPR points per game, wide receiver 10 pace across the 16 he played overall. A split output of 19.18 PPR points per game, which would have ranked as the wide receiver 5 across the full season. This was an absolute target hog. Over a 29% target share in these games and 10 targets per game in this split. For reference, he was on his way to a monster special sophomore campaign. 17-game base, like I kind of mentioned, 170 targets, 10 targets per game, 124 receptions, and over 1,400 receiving yards. All while, like I said, averaging over 19 PPR points per game. I have no doubt in my mind that Amon Ra St. Brown will resume that level of dominance going into 2023 and potentially contend for being a top 5 overall wide receiver in the 2023 season. He's that good. I expect this Lions offense to be that good, and I expect Amon Ra St. Brown to continue his role as the absolute target hog, the absolute figure of this offense. I know Matt Harmon's made this comparison, but the way I look at Amon Ra St. Brown is a Bud Light Cooper Kupp, where he can be the focal point, volume-based wide receiver on one of the best offenses in the NFL. I fully believe that is in the range of outcomes for Amon Ra St. Brown. I can see upwards of 20 PPR points per game as his ceiling. So definitely all in on him at that 1-2 turn cost. I have him about aligned with market right now. We move on to the 202, and that's going to be another wide receiver going off the board right now. Davante Adams, wide receiver of the Las Vegas Raiders, going off the board as the wide receiver 10 overall in fantasy football right now, according to Underdog ADP. And for the truth of his season, we look at his splits in games he played without Darren Waller on the field. And looking at these splits overall, his seasonal output, 19.7 PPR points per game, wide receiver 4 on the season in the 17 games he played. In terms of these splits, like I said, 22.8 PPR points per game, a wide receiver 2 pace across the full season. And what the split tells us is that Davante Adams is a superstar wide receiver, regardless of who his competition for targets is. We actually see that his seasonal target share, 32.6%, slightly decreased when Darren Waller was inactive to 31.24%. Obviously, we're dealing with such elite percentages, such elite target shares that it doesn't matter if he's falling 1.4%. So he's still going to be involved, but I did find it funny that he actually earned more targets when Darren Waller was on the field. The big discrepancy right here in terms of his seasonal output versus his split output of 22.8 PPR points per game in the split versus 19.7 is simply due to his touchdown rate in the split without Darren Waller. He scored 9 touchdowns in the 9 games he played, or of course, 1 touchdown per game. In the other 8 games he played with Darren Waller, he scored about 0.625 touchdowns per game, aka 5 touchdowns in the 8 games he played. Overall, I don't really have concerns about Davante Adams. The only real concern here would be potentially the status of Jimmy Garoppolo coming in, replacing Derek Carr, potentially being hurt. But I think Davante Adams at this point has earned the benefit of the doubt as being one of the best real-life talents that earns a number of targets that, to be honest, even if there's a subpar quarterback situation for Davante Adams, while it affects his overall ceiling, I do think that the volume here alone is going to keep his floor as a back-end wide receiver 1, and he's currently being priced as the wide receiver 10, so I'm all for him at this 1-2 turn area. 203 off the board is going to be Nick Chubb, running back of the Cleveland Browns, going off the board as the running back 4, according to Underdog Fantasy ADP. And in terms of his truth, we look at splits in games with Deshaun Watson at quarterback, and you guys can see that his split output is pretty underwhelming compared to his seasonal overall output, but I'll explain that in just a second. You guys see the seasonal output, 16.6 PPR points per game, a running back 6 pace across the 17 games he played. When Deshaun Watson played, though, that dropped to 10 PPR points per game, and RB 36 pace with Deshaun Watson at quarterback in. People who are looking at these raw numbers may start overreacting. But before we overreact to the drastic raw point total difference, obviously 18.9 PPR points per game in weeks 1 to 12 without Watson, 10 PPR points per game with Watson in weeks 13 to 17. We do have to consider that the biggest factor in all of this is the vast difference in touchdown efficiency. Chubb didn't score a single touchdown when Deshaun Watson was on the field in the stretch, compared to the 12 touchdowns he scored in the 11 games prior. So while we can look at this split and say, well, Deshaun Watson coming in is, from a baseline perspective, going to ruin Nick Chubb given these splits, once we contextualize the fact that Deshaun Watson should return to top 5 to 8 level quarterback play, this Browns offense as a whole, if he does so, is going to be a lot better. And with the presence of Kareem Hunt gone from this backfield, I expect Nick Chubb to assume a higher route participation role in this offense. In terms of Nick Chubb, I'm fine with him at this ADP. I think he's well worth a mid-second round type of pick, because I do think that this Browns offense can be one of the best offenses in the entire NFL. For Nick Chubb, the split doesn't really tell the full story, so I had to explain it further. 204, we got Jaylen Waddle, wide receiver of the Miami Dolphins, going off the board as the wide receiver 11 overall in fantasy football. And in terms of his truth, we look at his splits in games when Tua Tagovailoa was at full health, very similar to the splits I showed in last video with Tyreek Hill, but you guys can see that the same impact does happen when it comes to Tyreek Hill as it does with Jaylen Waddle. His seasonal output, of course, is going to be at 15.2 PPR points per game, which ranks as the wide receiver 12 in fantasy across the 17 games he played. The split output, though, when Tua Tagovailoa was healthy, was at 17.76 PPR points per game, a wide receiver 7 pace, on only a 21.06% target share. That's because, quite frankly, Jaylen Waddle is one of the most efficient wide receivers in the entire NFL. And fun fact, that 17.76 point per game split output would have rivaled the likes of CeeDee Lamb, A.J. Brown as a mid-level wide receiver 1 last year. That's how good and that's how viable Jaylen Waddle was in fantasy. Obviously, still bringing that spike week potential when Tua Tagovailoa was healthy. We know that, of course, he has to be extremely efficient. He only had a 127.5 target pace in the games Tua played. But despite that low target pace, this was a guy that was well on track for over 1,500 receiving yards. It's just a question of whether I want to bank on a 21% target share wide receiver in the early second when there's some target hogs and bell cows in this range of the draft. So while I love Jaylen Waddle and I would prefer him to be a late second round pick, if he's going around the likes of some of those wide receivers I mentioned, Amon Ra St. Brown, Davante Adams, Garrett Wilson, CeeDee Lamb, or some of those bell cow running backs like Nick Chubb we already got into, or a couple of the guys we'll get into in a second, I just personally think the 204 is a little steep for what I would want to pay for what Jaylen Waddle provides in terms of that big play potential, but a little bit volatile in terms of his play given the low target totals. Moving on to the 205, and that's going to be the running back 5 off the board according to Underdog Fantasy ADP, Jonathan Taylor. And you guys can see that the truth of his season relies upon games he played over 50% of the snaps. His seasonal output was at 12.2 PPR points per game, which ranked as the running back 22 in fantasy football come 2022 in the 11 games he played. The split output, however, was at 14.41 PPR points per game on about, what would that be, 23 opportunities per game. So definitely was fed in those games. However, 14.41 PPR points per game ranked as the running back 12 in fantasy football. I think Jonathan Taylor is a great real-life NFL talent and definitely played hurt in 2022. But I do think it's fair to ask just how high a ceiling he can realistically have with these low expectations for the Colts offense come 2023. The receiving involvement was the most encouraging part of his 2022 season. This guy averaged 3.9 targets per game in the splits he was healthy, which would have paced him for a much higher target total than he posted in his 2021 breakout campaign. But the overall efficiency and the touchdown output are what's letting him down from matching that 2021 level ceiling. I expect the efficiency to increase. Obviously, last year was a big downtick in terms of what can we expect from Jonathan Taylor moving forward. However, I do think it's fair to say that with Anthony Richardson coming in, it does pose a question just to how high the touchdown ceiling is in this offense. Again, rookie quarterback. as much as I like Anthony Richardson, he's a little bit underdeveloped at this point comparative to, some of the vet quarterbacks that Jonathan Taylor has even played with in the past with Wentz and Matt Ryan. And not to mention, we saw what Shane Steichen was able to do to unlock Jalen Hurts as a runner in 2022. I do have a question for once they're in the goal line situation, is Anthony Richardson going to get a share? Not to mention the raw rushing share, the overall market share of rushing opportunity in this offense is going to get affected by a quarterback that I think can push for upwards of 100 carries in year one. So as much as I love Jonathan Taylor, and I think he's a good bet to be a top 12 overall running back and is a fine mid-second round type of pick, but it's tough for me to rank him over options I just view with a flat out higher ceiling come round two. So I already mentioned the name Nick Chubb. I'm going to get into another name in a second that I would prefer over Jonathan Taylor. I think he's a fine pick. I just don't think he has that 2021 level Jonathan Taylor ceiling. 206 off the board is going to be running back Saquon Barkley of the New York Giants, going off the board as the running back 6 in ADP according to Underdog Fantasy. And for the truth of his season, we look at his splits in games post-bye week. So we're excluding the game against Philadelphia. He had 31% of the snaps due to, I believe it was a neck injury. Did not play well in that game, did not get the full snap, so I'm not going to count it in this split. However, when we do look at the split, we do see that his seasonal output, 17.8 PPR points per game. His split output, 17.2 PPR points per game. Not a big drop-off there. But we did see that Saquon experienced a decline in efficiency in the second half of the season. He dropped from a seasonal 4.45 yards per carry to 4.11 in the split, and a seasonal 4.45 yards per target rate to a 3.31 yards per target rate. So while the bottom line remained impressive at a 17.2 PPR point per game clip, he was getting a ridiculous 23.14 opportunities per game and 5.571 targets per game. If you guys equate that across a full 17-game season, it would have equated to 393 opportunities and a 94.7 target 17-game pace. So I am worried that the drop in efficiency may become a theme in 2023, on top of the risk, of course, that he holds out. He's a fine player. Again, this volume is absolutely massive. The only problem that I have is it does feel like a similar bet to what Joe Mixon represented in 2021. I don't think Saquon Barkley has that elite efficiency play left in his resume, simply because I do think he's a little bit worn out at this point. He's an older running back. He's fighting for that second contract. He's already got a lot of wear and tear on his tires that I think that rookie year, second year type of efficient, explosive Saquon may be a thing of the past. So in terms of me, I think he's fine at this mid-second round ADP, but he's not someone I'm going to be pushing up my board. He's not someone I'm going to be taking at the back end of the first round just because of his name value from the past. Because quite frankly, I do think, like I said, the days of Saquon Barkley having a 20-plus PPR point per game ceiling are over. 207 off the board is going to be Chris Olave, wide receiver of the New Orleans Saints. Wide receiver 12 off the board in Underdog Fantasy ADP. For the context of Chris Olave's 2022 campaign, there were really no patterns that I can find that we can really learn from moving forward in 2023. We just have to consider the fact that he put up an extremely impressive rookie season, totaled nearly 1,100 receiving yards in the 15 games he played, and posted a 26.7% target share, 15th among all wide receivers, and a 29.3% target rate, which ranked 10th among all wide receivers. I expect him to build off this impressive campaign going into year two, and I think he's a fine pick at this back end of the second, but he's someone I would prefer to get, in the early to mid third round, especially where I expect him to be come home league draft season. 208 off the board is going to be Patrick Mahomes, quarterback of the Kansas City Chiefs, quarterback 1 on Underdog Fantasy right now. And for the truth of his season, we look at splits in games he played with Juju Smith-Schuster at full health this year. His overall season output being at 25.2 PPR points per game. The splits with Juju involved were at 25.72 PPR points per game. So what the split tells us is that Patrick Mahomes, he is an absolute human cyborg playing the quarterback position. And regardless of the wide receivers around him, he will produce from a fantasy football perspective, evidenced by his ridiculous seasonal 25.2 PPR points per game, despite losing arguably the best wide receiver in the NFL last offseason with Tyreek Hill departing to the Miami Dolphins. Patrick Mahomes may be the only player in all of fantasy football that is completely situation-proof, quite simply because he's the best quarterback talent in the history of football. So in terms of Patrick Mahomes, if you want to take this guy at the back of your second round, let's say you get Travis Kelce in the first round and you want to pair him with Patrick Mahomes at the back end of the second, I do think given the advantage that these high-end quarterbacks give you this year, I'm more than fine with making that selection at the back end of the second round. But I would probably just wait for which of the top 3 quarterbacks last back to me as the quarterback 3 off the board. 209, we got Tony Pollard, running back of the Dallas Cowboys, going off the board as the running back 7 overall, according to Underdog Fantasy ADP. And for the truth of his season, we look at his splits once Dak Prescott returned to the Cowboys lineup in week 7 this past year. His overall seasonal output, he averaged 15.6 PPR points per game. However, once Dak returned in week 7, that number jumped up to 20.99 PPR points per game. And what the split tells us is that Tony Pollard is one of the biggest risers of this entire truth exercise. The difference in Tony Pollard's output pre and post Dak's return from his thumb injury is staggering. In the 6 games prior to Dak returning from injury and Tony usurping Zeke on the depth chart, he averaged 11.83 opportunities, 2.67 targets, and 9.68 PPR points per game. Once Dak returned to the lineup, there was a huge boost in his involvement. 18.78 opportunities per game, 4.22 targets per game, which would have equated to a 72 target pace across 17 games. And his overall fantasy points per game jumped from 9.68 to 20.99, like I mentioned. He was one of the most efficient running backs in the NFL, despite the increased workload in this stretch. And in this stretch, he totaled 5.31 yards per carry and 7.69 yards per target, despite, like I said, an increased workload from what he was used to prior in his career. With Ezekiel Elliott cut from the team this offseason and no real suitor to absorb his touch workload, he is one of the few backs outside of round 1 who has a legit league-winning level ceiling. So while I am biased, you guys see the Cowboys jerseys in the back, Tony Pollard's my running back 4 right now. I do think that out of all these second-round backs, we're talking about him. We're talking about Nick Chubb. We're talking about Saquon Barkley. We're talking about Jonathan Taylor. I think Tony Pollard has the highest ceiling of that collective group. So when it comes to Tony Pollard, the fact that he's going the latest of those guys, he is going to be one of my big targets going into draft season. He's a guy I would be comfortable taking in the top 15 overall of my fantasy drafts in 2023. 210 off the board right now is going to be Devonta Smith, wide receiver of the Philadelphia Eagles. And in terms of the truth of his season, we look at his splits in games with Dallas Goedert at full health. His overall seasonal output, he averaged 15 PPR points per game. With Dallas Goedert on the field, though, that didn't drop too far. He averaged 14.72 PPR points per game. What the split tells us, though, is that the splits with and without Goedert in the lineup are extremely similar, like I mentioned, as a whole. The only real difference here is that Devontae's target share drops from 27% on the season to 24.67% with Goedert on the field. He's a pretty safe, albeit low upside option in fantasy drafts right now, in my opinion, for a team that won't throw at a high volume. But I do think that Devonta Smith is an extremely overqualified number 2 wide receiver in the NFL who should produce simply because he's extremely good at football. He's not my favorite bet to make in round 2 because, again, like I mentioned, I do think the ceiling is capped here, given the low passing volume we should expect from the Philadelphia Eagles. But he's basically a lock to finish as a top 15 overall wide receiver in fantasy football. 211 off the board is going to be T. Higgins, wide receiver 14, according to Underdog Fantasy ADP right now. And for the truth of his season, we look at his splits in games he played over 50% of the snaps for the Cincinnati Bengals this year. Overall seasonal output, 14.9 PPR points per game. His split output, however, in the games he played over 50% of the snaps, 17.88 PPR points per game, which would have ranked him as the wide receiver 7 on the season on just a 22.57% target share. So what the split tells us is that T. Higgins, like Devonta Smith, is an overqualified number 2 wide receiver on one of the most efficient offenses in the NFL. The big difference, though, between the two, in my opinion, between T. Higgins, between Devonta Smith, is that the Bengals pass at a much higher rate than the Philadelphia Eagles did this past year. And although his 22.57 target share, like I said, is lower compared to Devonta Smith, it's still equated to 8.3 targets per game, and it's fair to expect that as long as he's healthy, he'll be threatening for 21 to 25% of Joe Burrow's targets, which could easily surpass 600 overall passing attempts for the second year in a row. While his ceiling isn't as a league winner, assuming his teammate Jamar Chase stays healthy, I do think he has a real chance of threatening a mid-wide receiver 1 status, which is splits say he was in 2022. And then finally, closing this video, we go to the 212 on Underdog ADP right now, and that's going to be Derrick Henry, running back of the Tennessee Titans, currently going off the board as the running back 8 overall, like I mentioned, on Underdog Fantasy. And for the truth of his season, we look at his splits in games when Ryan Tannehill was at full health. His overall season output, he averaged 18.9 PPR points per game. In the splits, however, when Ryan Tannehill was healthy, 17.6 PPR points per game. And in terms of the splits, I do think that the raw splits here don't do the king justice, given it excludes his blow up against the Houston Texans this year. I actually take the point per game difference in the split with a grain of salt. I more so look at the fact that his workload actually changed quite a bit in these contests. So the 20.58 carries per game he averaged when Ryan Tannehill was healthy would have actually paced for his lowest mark since 2019. but his target output was what was extremely encouraging. That 3.08 targets per game pace across 17 games would have equated to 52 targets, which absolutely blasts any other season in Derrick Henry's career. And it's fair to say that with a weak wide receiver core, he could push for another high target share relative to the rest of his career. And while his elite touchdown output will not be the same as the Titans offense regresses from his prime years and he gets less and less efficient the older he gets, if that's supplemented by more targets than what he's used to, I do think that his running back one status should be safe. I do, however, think he is a tough bet to make currently, given that he surpassed the touch and age apex. But if anyone is going to be an outlier when it comes to this metric, it's going to be the potential future Hall of Famer. That is the king himself, Derrick Henry. But if you guys enjoyed this video and you think you got some value from it, make sure you leave a like and subscribe if you're new to the channel. All the player cards from today's video and all of the coming videos in the Truth series will be made available over on flockfantasy.com. Using promo code FSC will get you 30% off of your subscription to the site and complete access to these player cards, along with all of mine and Corey's rankings, trade value charts, any study we do, along with priority access for future Dynasty Decisions episodes. By using our code FSC specifically, if you sign up annually right now, you can also get a free Zoom consultation with myself or Corey, and we can talk about whatever the heck you guys want to talk about. Dynasty strategy, live Dynasty Decisions breakdown, prepping for your guys' rookie drafts, advice for your redraft league, or even having the consultation while you're drafting in your home league. Whatever it is, we will be happy to talk about it. Also, all of the ADP in today's video comes from Underdog Fantasy. If you guys want to get some skin in the game right now, and if you notice an interesting trend from today's video that will help, go over to Underdog Fantasy, the ultimate preparation for your guys' home redraft leagues with the sharpest ADP out there. And if you go right now, you'll get a 100% match back on your first deposit up to $100 using promo code FSC. And using our code will get you access to our redraft rankings manifesto and cheat sheet once they come available in the next coming weeks, as well as all of our weekly rankings throughout the 2023 regular season to help you guys come home with the chip. Both of these codes are linked in the description as well. But with that being said, peace out and enjoy your Thursday.